Welcome back to Longwood's COMMCast, brought to you by the students in the Communication Studies major. My name is Jeff Halliday. I'm an associate professor in and chair of the Comm department, and I'm teaching this lab class this semester that produces this show. Quickly, I want to thank our students for all of their hard work to bring you this programming. For this episode, we're talking with Longwood's Office of Multicultural Affairs to learn more about the staff's efforts to empower and support historically marginalized and underrepresented students. Joining us in studio is Jonathan Page, Longwood's Director of Multicultural Affairs, as well as the Title VI Coordinator. Mr. Page also co-leads the University Diversity Council, whose 5-year diversity strategic plan was accepted into action by Longwood's Board of Visitors in 2021. Mr. Page, thank you for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
We got lots of questions. The first one I want to kind of start with is, if you be on this campus for 5 minutes, that's all it takes to know that your office does a lot and works with students in a variety of ways.
Right.
So could you please talk to us about the programming and the activities that you guys do for students?
Absolutely. And you know, I would say that one of the unique things about our office is not only are we housed in student affairs and really have a student-facing, focus, but we also do services for the entire campus as well. Longwood currently does not have a diversity office, per se, or a chief diversity officer. So what our office has, the pleasure of doing is serving in many of those capacities. But our primary focus really is working with students, and I would say that what we've done is really looked at 3 focus areas. So the first is in the neighborhood of cultural events, and programming. So if we look at things like the celebration of our cultural heritage months. The second is really our emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and justice trainings and workshops. So we do a lot with our student clubs and organizations. They reach out to us to identify areas of need, for which they would love to get, some information, some training, so we work with that. And the third piece, which I think is our most important element, particularly, post-COVID, and most certainly, post 2020, with the murder of George Floyd, is really how do we provide our students with more support, more outreach, more high touch. And so those are sort of the 3 focus areas, that we have. But we have a mentoring program, a RISE mentor program, which is in effect. So we always look for opportunities to bring underrepresented students, to train them to be mentors for incoming first-year students to aid in their transition, because we know that one of the challenges that students face when they come to a predominantly white institution like Longwood is, how do I find my community? How do I find my place? How do I get connected? How can I establish that sense of belonging? So the mentor program does that. We also have a strong focus on leadership. So we have the C.H.A.N.G.E for Leadership series, which we have with our culturally based clubs and organizations. We host those 3 to 4 times a year. And it really helps not only in sort of the leadership development of our student clubs and our student leaders, but it also helps them in their planning, in their collaboration, and in their overall transitions from one administration to the next. So those are just some of the programs and ways that our office works on campus.
It's a significant number, and you referenced several of these in that response. But a lot of times what your office needs to really do is work with students, like you said, high touch, right?
Right.
And a lot of students have created several independent student-run organizations as a result of working with your office, which is a unique balance to work with them. So you mentioned community building. That's what a lot of these groups do. They focus on building community for underrepresented student populations.
Right.
How does your office work to empower and support those organizations and those students in particular, but especially in the last couple of years, as we kind of learn how to be together again?
Right. And that's the exciting part, and that's a great question, and thank you so much for asking it, because one of the things that we're most excited about this year is that we have 2 new culturally based organizations that are entering the pipeline. The first is the Native Student Organization, one of which we've never had before, and the second is our Muslim Student Association. So we have worked with those groups from sort of the very beginning, kind of marshaling them through the process of getting recognized by S.G.E as a full-fledged organization. What we also do, and we started this a few years ago, is we started a multicultural club and organization council called C.H.A.N.G.E. It provides them with a voice. It provides them with leadership training, activism. A lot of the changes that you're seeing on campus are due in no small part to the work of the students who are in C.H.A.N.G.E. So that's what we really try to do, is empower students. We try to educate, we try to advocate, we empower, give them the tools necessary to be change agents. And so that's really, sort of the foundation of the office.
One of the groups you just discussed was C.H.A.N.G.E, and it's a unique new organization at campus, and it is a coalition of groups that really are forming a stronger, if I can say that, but a more collective representative voice for students on our campus. Can you talk about how that came to be and that impact that they're having on campus that you referenced?
Absolutely. So again, I am really blessed to be able to work with some really talented people, one of them being Quincy Goodine, who is the Associate Director of Multicultural Affairs and Leadership Development. And a couple of years ago, he and I were talking about what are some things that we can do, because we saw some of the struggles that our students were facing on campus. And so we said, okay, what do we need to do? Because we talk about change agency all the time. And so this bright idea hit us, change. And so change then is an acronym. It stands for community, humanity, allyship, networking, grace, and equity. Putting particular emphasis on the grace piece, because so often I think in the age now that we are with DEI is people feel as if, cancel culture, is, a tremendous thing. And so what we try to talk about is how do we engage in grace, that sometimes people don't know what they don't know. And it's an opportunity to help them to learn, to grow, and to understand, but that comes from grace. And so that was one of the key hallmarks of that. And so looking at that, students, from the multicultural clubs and organizations come together as a coalition, to really bring the needs and the concerns and the voices of underrepresented students into the fore, so that we can amplify those voices. Not that we're necessarily speaking for them, but we're certainly providing the platform for those voices to be heard. And so that's where C.H.A.N.G.E does. And we're really excited that C.H.A.N.G.E as an organization has regular meetings with senior leadership on campus, particularly with President Reevely and with Provost Smith, and with VPSA Cameron Patterson. And working in conjunction with the Diversity Strategic Plan, which you had alluded to earlier, again, it provides a little bit more focus for our students who can say, well, we've identified these as strategies, so how can we as a student organization, as a student coalition, how can we support the institution in instituting those changes?
Well, you spoke to the student experience, and related to that and the points you just made, based on university employment data, we know that roughly 87% of the Longwood faculty and staff self-report and identify as white. The number is even higher amongst faculty, if I'm correct.
Right.
And that the undergraduate student population at Longwood is predominantly a white institution.
Correct.
It's firmly there, as you previously stated.
Right.
So in your professional experience, what challenges does that continue to create for students of color and their experience as students on our campus?
I think really what it boils down to is representation or lack thereof. What we've seen and what our students have told us is again, they understand that the university is oftentimes exceedingly white. And so when you're in the classroom environment, you don't see faculty that sort of look like you, that have similar experiences to you, or that can relate to you. What can we do to sort of create that sense of community? What can we do? Again, it always comes back to that idea of belonging. But it's tough. But it's very, very important, because we know, and the literature bears this out, that if students don't feel connected, they're not going to stay. And so now we're talking about issues of retention. So it's not simply a matter of recruiting diversity to campus, but how do we maintain diversity, on campus? And so really we want to improve the student experience, because I think if we look at how the demographics of the country are going, if we look at the demographics of the world as they continue to evolve and change, the reality is we cannot stay homogenous.
Well, speaking of the world evolving and changing and some of the issues that you face on a daily basis, your office works through. On the OMA website, there's a pretty profound statement at the top. And what it basically says is diversity is a fact, inclusion is a practice, and equity is the goal. And those terms, diversity, equity, inclusion, they've been really further politicized, particularly in states like Florida and Texas, where we have governmental leadership in those states that has taken aim at weakening related initiatives to DEI, particularly on college campuses. Because it's critical to Longwood's strategic plan, as we've discussed, and the work of your office. You mentioned rhetoric. Can you discuss the consequences of that kind of rhetoric, and then the importance of that work that's needed on behalf of students on our campus?
Right. So we kind of have to look at it in two ways. One, you have what's sort of what we look at as being rhetorical, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then you have more structural and functional diversity, equity, and inclusion. The rhetorical is very superficial. It is what we often talk about is it's where you check the box. It doesn't really require a tremendous investment of time, energy, or resources, but nothing really happens within the system to change how things operate. It doesn't change policy.
Not authentic.
Exactly.
Right.
And so when we look at it that way, you're seeing a tremendous pushback because there's fear. And we just have to call it what it is. It's an underlying fear. It's the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of change. And so people want to have that degree of agency. You know, while I may have had this term, you know, ascribed to me, now that no longer fits. I'm not going to allow you to call me by those terms. I'm not going to allow myself or my identities to be marginalized and oppressed anymore. I want them to be more centralized and mainstreamed. One of the things that we talk about with DEI all the time and how we move from sort of that rhetorical to the structural is how do we get out of our own echo chambers? And really, I think that's where you get to the structural, is when you spend some time not only doing the deep analysis of who I am as an individual, but now where does that put me with respect to someone else? We put a great deal of emphasis on the D of DEI in terms of diversity, but that's why I love, you know, the sort of the mantra of our office is diversity is a fact. We know that it exists. You know, people in their own identities are diverse based on, you know, the various, you know, cultural and social groups to which they belong. So diversity is there. Of course, historically, when we talk about diversity, we're referring to race and ethnicity. But I like to shift the lens a little bit more. Let's focus on inclusivity and accessibility. Because when we talk about what inclusion looks like, you know, there's a difference between inclusion and integration. Integration simply means that you have diverse perspectives in a space, but it doesn't mean that they're part of the decision-making process. It really doesn't mean that they have a full and equal, you know, voice at the table, but they're there in the space. That's integration. So what we need to now start thinking about is what does full inclusion look like? And if we start to focus on that, and then we start to now look at the broader idea of accessibility. What does accessibility mean and what does it look like? How does that mean that we have to change some of our practices, how we have to change some of our policies, how we have to change much of our outlook? You know, and then once we start focusing on the I and the A, then it naturally leads us to the equity because it helps us to formulate an equity mindset. And so when we talk about, you know, diversity being, you know, a fact, inclusion being a practice, it's what we do, but equity is the goal. And the reason why I think that it's a goal is it's aspirational, meaning that we never really fully arrive at equity because it's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving. So what's equitable today is not necessarily what's going to be equitable tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now. And so it's always the goal. And what it does is it requires us to focus on continuous improvement.
That's directly related to a lot of what you were talking about with change and that grace, understanding that this is a never-ending journey.
Absolutely.
Right, towards that form of equity.
Absolutely. And it's very much in the terms when we think about how do we develop competencies. Well, all of a sudden you don't get a certificate that says you are 100% competent. It's, okay, right now you have the rudimentary understanding, but it's going to continue to evolve. And that's why we have continuing education. The same thing applies.
It requires our willingness to continue to have those
and intentionality.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank Mr. Jonathan Page for joining us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your work on our campus, too. It is appreciated. That's all for this episode. On behalf of our crew and the Comm Department, I am Jeff Halliday. Thanks for spending some time with us, and we'll see you on the next COMMCast.